I'm comfortable saying that, I want Pierre Poilievre to win. I want him to be prime minister. I hope that people vote conservative. Like most people living here in Canada, like what's going on in Israel-Palestine is just not very relevant to their lives. So why do they get radicalized by that issue of all issues? As long as you can sort of be the guy in power, as long as your people are in power, the perseverance of a sort of tolerant liberal system doesn't really matter.
What's your new video? I'm interested.
This might be of some interest to your audience because it's not a super typical kind of like JJ video. It's I'm talking about like democracy and sort of like the theory of democracy, and then I talk about 6 democratic sort of paradoxes, sort of like 6 ways in which the logic of democracy can be used to kind of like destroy itself or damage itself.
Oh,
and I feel like that's sort of like a uniquely important topic right now, when we're all talking about the future of democracy and all of that. So
what?
Yeah, I don't know.
What are the paradoxes?
So, like, the paradoxes, like one of. Okay, let me just go to my my scene here, and so I can read them out to you. Yeah, so like one of the paradoxes of democracy is just the fact that you can like amend the constitution to make it do undemocratic things, right? Like this is how sort of Russia starts off as a democracy, and then they just democratically amend their constitution a million times until it's not really a democratic system anymore. So like that's one way that the logic of democracy can be used to kind of like destroy itself. And we know that like that's how Hitler comes to power, and like there have been tyrants over the years who have used democratic systems and then have passed constitutional amendments in order to make them into dictatorships. So like that's a flaw of democracy. I talk about Lindsey Graham syndrome, which is the idea that once somebody is elected, like it's kind of undemocratic to oppose that person. So you kind of just have to sort of suck up to even a bad leader and endure a bad leader. And, this is why they sometimes have military coups and stuff like that, because there's a thinking that, sometimes there's a leader that's so bad, he has to sort of be forcibly removed from office. Like the voters have failed the nation, and then there has to be a kind of like undemocratic solution to that. And then I talk about just like voting yourself money from the public treasury, how that can bankrupt a country. I talk about the classic sort of paradox, which is the tyranny of the majority. It's very easy in a democratic society to establish a system of government that is only governing on the basis of whoever is in the numerical majority. You can think of like segregation in the South, where the white majority oppresses the black minority in horrible ways. And then I just talk about lying, which is like the oldest way to kind of deform a democracy. We're seeing that now, I think, in the current American presidential election, like just how much fantasy and just how much like outright lies can you get away with before you've kind of created an alternate sort of universe that people are participating in instead of the real one. And a related one is just the idea of people, like when the voters just don't take their duties as voters seriously, right? Like democracy is based on the premise that the people govern, but if the people decide they don't want to govern, and if instead they're just electing politicians based on vibes or how they make them feel, or even more sort of stupid superficial things, the democratic system has kind of broken down at that point as well. So yeah, that's kind of the quick summary, I guess.
That's awesome. That's so cool, actually.
I hope you like it. I hope the viewers like it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, that's like the whole with this sort of rise. I don't want to say like a rise in fascism, but optically on the internet with Nick Fuentes, or even did you catch any of this like Nick Fuentes, Sneeko, Aiden Ross stream that's been going viral recently?
No, tell me about it.
They had have you seen this? Jubilee?
Yeah, of course.
Have you seen this young guy on Jubilee? He went viral like 2 weeks ago. He debated like 20 pro-MAGA people on Jubilee and did a really good job of like handling his own. I believe his name's Dean. He's okay. Like 18.
No, I didn't see that. I saw the other one where Charlie Kirk was debating everybody. So this was kind of like a left-wing version of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Very young man. I believe he was like, I think he's only 18 or 19, and he did a really good job. He handled himself quite well, and very very pro-democracy, very much like moderate left sort of guy. It wasn't like a like woke or anything. Yeah. Anyway, and then he was invited on. There's like Sneeko, Aiden Ross, who are both in Toronto at the same time, had Nick Fuentes on and had Andrew Tate on, and then this guy got invited in.
Okay.
And he just like got them to say, in my opinion, just like such ridiculous shit. And he ended up getting kicked out of the chat, but they were like, I'd rather have Hitler than a woman run for president. He got like Aiden Ross said that, just like, you know, towing the line with the other people who's in the chat with. And there's sort of this like rise in vibe fascism on the internet of people who are like you say, of people who kind of like universalists who extrapolate their own beliefs out, and they're like, okay, this is what I like, this is what works for me, therefore it's good, it's objectively good, we should run with this.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, this idea that like a paradox in democracy is when you elect someone that you don't like, but if you don't have the first principle of democracy being like the overall good, and then sometimes there's folly with it, but like as long as it's still democratic, everything's all right. People are kind of turning against that now.
Yeah, because I mean, like, it's a much more kind of I don't know how to put it, but it is a kind of like sort of fascist logic where it's like the most important sort of issue is who's in power, who's at the top of the pyramid, who's at the top of the hierarchy, and sort of like any sort of means are justified to get to that end. As long as you can sort of be the guy in power, as long as your people are in power, you know, the perseverance of a sort of tolerant liberal system doesn't really matter. In fact, in some ways, that's sort of seen as threatening. And I think that becomes a sort of natural end result when you've demonized the other side to such an extent that you're no longer sort of having this kind of sense of your culture as one in which there's kind of like a diversity of ideas and people debate and argue about different things. And sometimes this party's in power and sometimes that party's in power. But, you know, we have regularly scheduled elections and there's a kind of sort of cycle and churn, and there's a kind of like healthy life to the system, right? If you instead imagine the system in this kind of like using sort of totalitarian logic, where it's like there's like one kind of like caste of people that are ordained to rule, and then there's like this vast other sort of group of people who are just kind of like wicked and diseased and evil and, you know, illegitimate, sort of, they're not even citizens anymore, right? Like that there's something else, they're like enemies, right? Then, of course, it's very easy to sort of rationalize a logic in which there is no democracy, in which there is no liberalism, in which there is no freedom. There is just kind of like rule by those who deserve to rule, and then those who deserve to rule exercise their will in a very blunt and, you know, often violent and authoritarian way. And I think that's really disturbing that anybody is sort of normalizing that kind of philosophy of government instead of the philosophy of government that's, you know, embodied by the U.S. Constitution and, you know, the last 200 years of American history. It is really, and I think you're right, Brogan, when you often point out that so many of these people are just at their core anti-American, right? Like they hate, you know, they hate the Constitution, they hate the American way, and they hate, you know, like over half the country. Like they hate their fellow citizens. They want to see half the country like destroyed and ground under their own oppressive jackboot. It's really upsetting and just so hateful and anti-American.
No, I can't stand it. I can't stand, like, I don't know, why do you think people have become so disenfranchised on just like neighborliness of understanding that, I don't know if it's like some people want different things, or if like you see that you see yourself as like at war with the other side, like constantly at war with the other side. Like it's literally existential, as if you're losing a battle. You're not just a part of the process anymore. That is the totality of like the West. You are a side opposed to the other side, now losing a battle, and it's like every election or every year, all of a sudden the West is at like an existential threat of collapsing, and the West has fallen. It's a very weird phenomenon.
Yeah, it is. And because like the thing that I sort of struggle with is like, how seriously do these people even believe some of what they're saying, right? Because, you know, a lot of these people are like white supremacists and Christian nationalists, and they have this like very socially conservative sort of agenda. And yet when you look at them in their day-to-day lives, you know, they'll have friends that are gay, and, you know, they'll be friends with black people and, you know, irreligious people. And like, you know, they kind of, they don't necessarily practice what they preach, right? And so it just kind of makes me wonder, like, and I'm sure you might have some insight into this, like, to what degree is this just kind of a LARP? Like, to what degree is this a kind of a, what is that term that the kids use for when something's like a game that you play in, like, the real world? You know, like, where there's, like, what is that word? Where there's like little quizzes, or there's like it's like a scavenger hunt or something that you play in the real world, even though it's kind of a game. It's like an acronym, like an MRG or an MRI or something.
RPG?
No. It's like it's not like sorry, this is like bothering me now. It's not a LARP. It's like a virtual reality game. It's like a game that you play in the real world. Oh, an ARG. That's right. An ARG. Yes, thank you. So it's sort of treating like politics like it's an ARG, like that there's kind of like this game that you play sometimes when you're on chat shows or podcasts or when you're streaming or whatever. You sort of play along to this certain kind of logic of the world, and there's language and villains and heroes and all that. But then when the camera goes off and you go back to your normal life, you go log off 4chan or whatever, you're not necessarily actually living that world. But the terrifying thing is that people are voting on the basis of that ARG sort of political LARP life that they're playing. And I don't know. And I feel like part of the reason why like the ARGification of politics is popular is because I think a lot of people are just, kind of bored. And I think that our society is maybe like in some ways too prosperous for its own good. Like people are kind of decadent and people are just kind of feel idle, and that they want to believe that they're like living lives of excitement and drama and, very high stakes and all this kind of stuff, rather than finding meaning in perhaps other things. They're sort of turning to finding meanings in this. I don't know. What's your sort of sense of that? Like, do you believe that these people believe what they're saying half the time? Or do you like, what degree do you think that there is a kind of like LARPy aspect to it?
I mean, it's what, there's two factors. I think it's first, it's what drives engagement. I've experienced this firsthand. I can clearly see. I was talking about this last stream. I can clearly see the avenue for my channel where I become more reactionary and more extreme, and I could see how that would do well for me. I could see how I could carve out like my own little cult on the internet of being that person. It's people are hungry for it because it's like, I don't know, people just want, like, it's easy, like your critique of philosophy and of theory is that it's like you can make these wild sweeping claims that sound very poetic and very dopaminergic, and it's fun to do. It's fun to make these wild lateral connections about like how the world works. Like, oh, this is it, I figured it out. I'm 26 and I know exactly how everything runs. Right? And that's fun. And it's like you really get a lot of audience capture when you say shit like that. When Nick Fuentes goes on and talks about like how America is a white country and it's like other races getting in the way, or like when Haas talks about mega communism, and or when I was just talking about or showing Curtis Yarvin on here like half an hour ago, when he talks about how like democracy is the problem, like democracy, we need to get rid of democracy because we need monarchy, or we need something to like make to get rid of bureaucracy, right? It's so exciting to think of like, oh, the answer is so different than the way things work right now, and we need to like throw the whole system out. So there's this engagement level with it, but then also it's like identity as well. I think this is I've been thinking about this a lot recently with like young people's information overload. I think that if you take someone who is very like, let's say like nonpartisan on an issue like Israel-Palestine, and you feed them, you could really convince that person of both sides depending on what you feed them. If there's no objective answer, there's no like right versus wrong anymore. It's like there's so much information available that you could kind of come to like, it's hard to come to an objective conclusion, I think. And it's like,
but that's an interesting example, right? Because like if we think of something like Israel-Palestine, which obviously a lot of people have become very radicalized on that issue, like ultimately that is obviously there's a human tragedy to it that is worth being compassionate about, but at like the end of the day, that is a good example of an issue that just doesn't matter to most people's lives. Like most people living here in Canada, like what's going on in Israel-Palestine is just not very relevant to their lives. So why do they get radicalized by that issue of all issues? Why do they sort of choose to spend so much time posting and caring and marching in the streets about an issue that's happening way on the other end of the world that very likely doesn't affect anybody that they know, right? And I feel like a lot of these issues kind of can be described in a kind of like similar way, where it's just like the radicalism just feels very abstract. Like it feels very kind of like LARPy. And then you have to sort of think that it's just the idea of being part of something that has some air of importance to it that is kind of alluring unto itself.
I mean, that one specifically is tough. I think maybe like Russia and Ukraine's a better example, because there is like such an emotional. I mean, there's an emotional aspect of Russia versus Ukraine, but I think Israel Palestine has such an obvious emotional, like, kind of heartstring tug of like, here's, you know, all these children. I mean, if you don't know much about, like, and I'm not one to talk, like, I'm not well versed in like the depth of the issue, but if you just look at like the sheer fact of how many like children are getting killed, it's very easy to like just take the emotional route. Maybe I feel like Russia Ukraine's a better example of that. The people who are very pro Russia from just this like abstract internet ideology standpoint, rather than having facts, or rather than like being pragmatic about it.
Yeah, like they would have no desire to live in Russia. You know, I don't even think, honestly, that they have a desire to live under like a Russian style political system, right? If they think about it sort of logically, but they'll claim that they want to, and they'll claim that, you know, Putin's based and this is like a much better society than the one that we have. Like it just kind of feels like it's a conversation that's happening at the level of like discussing, you know, Game of Thrones or the Marvel Cinematic Universe or something like that. It's like people can get very defensive and have very long, passionate arguments about sort of fictitious worlds. And I just kind of like worry that a lot of political discourse is sort of treating the world of politics like it is a sort of world of fiction. It's just troubling, though, because, like I say, you know, it does ultimately manifest in the form of how people are choosing to vote. Not because the politicians are necessarily going to implement the kind of wild agendas that they want to, but because, you know, like politicians like Trump just kind of get sort of bound up in that universe, and they sort of become sort of branded with, you know, one side or the other, and then people think that, you know, voting for him becomes an expression of their own sort of like radical identity in some way. And I think that is, you know, because Curtis Yarvin or whatever can sort of say that he hates democracy or whatever, but, you know, he's still supporting an idiotic sort of politician like Donald Trump, and has sort of intellectualized his way into making that seem like a sort of sensible thing. And you know, sometimes these people are too intellectual for their own good, and they can talk themselves into, you know, supporting real world solutions that are not solutions, that they're just you know, they're deeply destructive outcomes that will have very real world negative consequences that will not at all resemble sort of like the philosophy that they purport to believe in.
Also, I mean, all these people live in a country where you can say you hate democracy, and there's no repercussion to it.
Yeah, you know, exactly. For all that, and this is why, like, then conspiracy theories kind of have to fill the void, right? So it's like, you know, they speak about like the regime, and they, you know, Trump just had his big rally today, and you know, J.D. Vance, who is sort of in tight with like the Curtis Yarvin sort of set, is talking about how like they're trying to kill Trump and they don't want us to do that, and they tried to throw him in prison and all that. Like they just use like conspiracy theory and lies basically to kind of almost try to like manifest into existence the world of their online of LARP and fantasy and abstract conversations. And that's, again, that becomes very destructive when it actually results in, you know, a ignorant buffoon like Donald Trump being elected, because somehow they've convinced themselves that is the appropriate sort of real world manifestation of their political project.
I know, it's bizarre. Like, even the video I'm working on right now, I spent the whole day researching the Honduran coup of 2009. And just the amount
that's a controversial statement, Brogan, to call that a coup. What happened in Honduras?
I was gonna text you about it because I was like, reading all these angles about it, and the amount of people that were like, if it's a coup or if it's not a coup, and what actually happened. And I was like, I feel like JJ would immediately have just like paragraphs to say about this.
I don't have like the most to say about it, but I you know, because obviously I was alive when that happened. And I definitely remember that being a lot of the discourse, which would be that sort of like left-wing people characterized what happened as a coup, and they sort of said that the the Obama administration. This was like a very popular thing, if I recall correctly, that like sort of like the far left was saying, because like the far left wanted to go after Obama for saying like, oh, he's not that much different than Bush after all, and this kind of thing, and the idea that like, oh, the Obama administration has like consented to this undemocratic coup in Honduras. I just remember like there being a lot of discourse about that, and so I would just be having memories of that. I would be a little, because I feel like these days, it's easy to, I mean, like Trump does this, like it's easy to characterize sort of outcomes of the political system that you don't necessarily agree with as being akin to coups. And I don't know enough about the specifics of the situation, but to me, like a coup is like, when the military sort of shows up and deposes a democratically elected leader and sort of installs some sort of military government. I feel like, I mean, you might know more, I'm sure you all will certainly do know more about this than me because you've been researching it. But it's like when a president sort of steps down because, he's become very unpopular, or because like there's protests in the streets, and, or if he's impeached by the Congress or whatever, it's like I'm much less willing to characterize sort of mechanical sort of outcomes like that as coups. So like what is your understanding exactly of how their leader was deposed?
So
why people call it a coup.
My step-by-step here is that he was going to Manuel, they called him Mel Zelaya, I believe was the full name. He wanted to have a referendum because Honduran presidents can only run for one term, and they can't legally serve for 2 terms. So he was going to have a referendum to change the constitution to allow presidents to run for more than, or to stay in power for more than 1 term.
Uh-huh.
And the Supreme Court, important to all of this, is that this referendum would have happened after he got voted out. Like, he wouldn't have been in power while this was happening. So the Supreme Court said it was like unconstitutional to have this referendum, and that he had to be had to throw the whole thing off, and he refused to do it. So he got exiled, and it was in the middle of the night. Like the military came while he was sleeping, took him out of his house, and sent him to Costa Rica.
Uh-huh.
And then installed a de facto interim president until the next democratic election. So that was June 28th, 2009, and the election wasn't until November 2009. So there was he did get couped. I mean, he was against the Supreme Court, but he wasn't asking for anything that was like, he wasn't trying to stay in power forever. And he did get like,
the idea was that his term had ended.
But he wasn't trying to keep running. Like, he was just trying to have a referendum to change the Constitution, to vote to change the Constitution, to allow presidents to run for more than 1 term. Yeah. But he wouldn't have been in power. Like, it would not have affected his length in power. It was just, it would have happened after he was voted out.
Uh-huh.
And then when the Supreme Court said he couldn't do it, he said that he kept trying to put it through, and that's when he got like literally couped, like just taken out of office by the military and sent away.
But that was, hold on, I'm still kind of confused about the procedure here. So it's like, was that his scheduled time for departure?
Yes, yeah, he would have been out.
Yeah. So it's like it's kind of like, it's sort of like Trump or whatever, right? Like you're trying to stay in beyond your sort of like legal limit, right? Like independent of him trying to change the Constitution or whatever, like at some point there becomes a sort of hard limit where you like literally have to vacate the premises because it's illegal for you to stay there anymore.
No, it was before.
That's not the case? It
was before that. He would have been out. So the next election wasn't until November, and he got kicked out in June.
Okay.
Yeah. So he wasn't trying to, like, he was not staying longer than he should have at all.
Uh-huh. And then who became the new president?
It was I gotta get my document up here. It was a de facto interim president until the next election from June to November.
Yeah, but this is like significant as well, right? Because it's like, who was that person, right? And did the president resign, right? Because like if the president resigns, then there's like some sort of order of succession that kicks in, right? And there's some sort of like legally constitutional person that becomes president the next day, right? So it's sort of significant to understand like who that individual was. If that's a person that was just kind of like plucked out of thin air from the military, or that the military sort of like put him on the chair because they like that guy and he was not in the order of succession, then I think there's a stronger argument to be made that that is like a literal coup. But if the president is sort of just, you know, basically bullied into resigning and the person who's next in line takes over, then that seems like it's more constitutional and more acceptable.
It was Roberto Micheletti was his name.
And what was his previous job?
Let me see here. I know he was Italian. He's not even Honduran. Politician who served interim president, Honduras, June 28th to January 2010. Deputy. See, he was presided over the National Congress of Honduras from 25th January 2006 to 28th of June 2009, and that was the day he became the de facto president.
So he was like the head of the Congress, like maybe the speaker or the president of the Congress or whatever. And a lot of times those are the people that are sort of next in line, constitutionally speaking, when presidents are removed.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't want to. I really don't remember this episode that well. I just remember it being sort of like a thing that people talked a lot about at the time, particularly as it related to like what was the Obama administration's like knowledge or acceptance of this sort of transition in power. But like, what is the because I like, was he a left winger? I remember like this being an issue that like left winger people cared about at the time. The president who was deposed, was he like a sort of leftist kind of guy?
Yeah, he was a center left. He had a few. I'd say like democratic socialist sort of policies. He raised the minimum wage, and he also got rid of it was like hourly work for laborers, so they had to be salaried so they could unionize, stuff like that. And then when this intermittent president came in, he there was like a whole media blackout on what was actually happening. He like shut down any critical radio stations or news networks against his presidency or against what was happening at the time. And the new guy who came in was center right, and then immediately reversed a lot of the more socialist stuff that the old president had put through. So
there's like a couple of things that sort of come to my mind when you sort of tell the story that way. One is that basically like what was the president's relationship like with the Congress? What was, because in these sorts of countries, the Congress and the president are elected separately. And, a lot of times the Congress is controlled by a party that's very hostile to the president. And a lot of times the parties that are hostile to the president play a large role in sort of like whipping up opposition to some of the president's more unpopular policies. So I would be curious to know like what the internal, like the domestic sort of political dynamic was as far as that kind of thing goes.
Yeah, the Congress is more right wing.
Okay, yeah. So there was some sort of internal sort of domestic tension. I'd also be curious to know, because this is something I definitely do remember very vividly from those days, was when Hugo Chavez was president of Venezuela, and he was sort of seen as this, very authoritarian kind of like leftist strongman in that country. And that there was always like a lot of anxiety about whether or not world sort of leaders in South and Latin America were allied with Chavez or not. And because when people were allied with Chavez, they were sort of seen as perhaps putting their country on the road to that sort of style of authoritarian sort of socialism. Do you have any sense of if he was like a Chavista? Was he part of the sort of the Chavez bloc?
Yeah, he was allied. I don't know if it was allied, but I know they were close. And then Nicaragua as well, which I'm not sure of the politics of Nicaragua at the time. But I know, he was close to Chavez and Nicaragua.
Nicaragua. I don't know exactly when their current government came to power, but they're a very sort of authoritarian leftist regime as well. So that's interesting. Yeah, because I feel like this is now starting to come back to me a little bit more vividly, because I feel like the idea was, like, should Obama recognize this new government that came to power? And that was itself, like, that was a sort of contentious thing, because then it was sort of like, if Obama recognized the new government, that was sort of seen as putting a stamp of approval on, a government a president that maybe had sort of come to power under sort of dubious conditions, but then there was like other people like conservatives in America that were like, no, this transition was very proper and correct and legal and constitutional, and the president was just a sort of Chavez tyrant in the making. Yeah.
My understanding is that if him and then Hillary Clinton at the time both like vocally said it was a coup, but then legally never declared it a coup, and their reasoning was that if under law they would have had to cut off all funding to Honduras.
Yeah.
And I guess they were giving a lot at the time, especially because Honduras was such a poor country. So they did. Hillary specifically and the Secretary of State didn't want to cut off funding, and they would have had to if they like legally were like, oh, this like the U.S. officially recognizes what happened as a coup. So they said they thought it was a coup, but they never actually recognized it as a coup.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Well, we certainly went on a long tangent about that. I'm sure the audience appreciaes that. But
I was a rabbit.
That sounds interesting.
Well, I was down a rabbit hole all day because I'm trying to talk about this Honduras thing, and I was like, there's this whole thing with these ZAs, zones for employment and economic development. And then to understand those, I'm like, okay, I have to go into like how these came to be, and then I just ended up reading like emails from like leaked emails from Hillary Clinton from like 2009 about Honduras for like 4 hours.
I feel like the thing that I'm like, the reason why like I was initially kind of a little skeptical is just because I feel like when we talk about the politics of Latin America, particularly when we talk about coups or things that are kind of like coups or presidents sort of leaving office under some sort of state of duress, there often is a sort of tendency to imagine that these things are very sort of like simple single cause kind of math equations, like event X happens, president B gets deposed, and new government comes to power, and it's like that there's like a very clear kind of like cause and effect sort of type of situation. And what we often sort of, I think, minimize the importance of is the degree to which these countries have sort of politics of their own, and that there is sort of like active political debate in these countries, and that the way that sort of weird things can happen in those sorts of places is not always a reflection of just sort of like powerful outside forces, or just the sort of the influence of like the wealthiest kind of like elite within that society that is just kind of abracadabraing governments in and out of power and all of that. That there is often kind of like complex sort of like domestic internal political things, including like that these leaders are often very sort of contentious figures in their own countries, right? And I feel like left-wing people in particular often like to portray these sorts of things as like the left-wing president is always like a great hero of the people and everybody loves him, and the only people that hate him are either like the evil Americans or like the most sort of pampered wealthy elite in that society. And then if a president sort of is deposed, it's like, well, it looks like the rich had their way, and looks like the poor are now back to the under the boot and all of this kind of stuff. So like, I'm not sort of saying that that you're going to characterize it as happening that way, or that anybody else is, but that's just sort of something that I often think about, just as somebody that's been observing these kinds of things for a while. The degree to which we seem to often be quick to sort of take away the agency of individual sort of people in these countries to have sort of political views and to have debates and to sort of express an organic dissent towards their particularly sort of leftist governments when they do exist.
No, I know. I mean, in the video and then in the research I was doing, it was kept being characterized as a U.S.-backed coup, and from my understanding is that the U.S. continued to fund after the coup, fund the military of the at the time, which like there's a bunch of like human rights violations during like the months preceding or the months before the next actual election.
Yeah. So
there's this question of like, why was the U.S. funding? It was like $200 million. Why were they funding the military at the time? If they were trying to, if they were cutting off funding for other things, they'd cut off funding for a project to like help build roads. Like they cut off all this funding, but they still were funding the military massively in Honduras.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but then when people say like I feel like that's a term or like it's a concept that gets thrown around so much that like genuinely I don't know a lot about is like all these alleged U.S. backed coups in or U.S. backed leaders in South America and Central America.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because like, like, and again, like these are very complicated issues, right? And again, like I think that there's often a lot of domestic factors that lead up to things like coups or the resignations of presidents and this kind of stuff. And that a lot of times people on the outside are not terribly interested in learning about the domestic political situation. So instead there's this idea that like, America waves the magic wand and then like, there's a coup or some guy gets in or out or whatever. And I think that is a sort of frame that a lot of people are very used to thinking about that part of the world in, right? Like the classic example is that there was a military coup in Chile in 1973 that deposed a sort of socialist president. And that in that case, that was objectively like a coup. Like that was like a military coup. The military came in and then ruled that country for like 15 years single-handedly. General Pinochet, who was he was the head of the armed forces and he was the president. There was a complete fusion of civilian and military government. Anyway, the point is that coup is often described as being like a US-backed coup. And there is evidence, to suggest that the Nixon administration was happy to see it happen and that, had even been investing money into propaganda in favor of the coup and all the rest of it. But when I was in Chile and when I went to the museum about the military dictatorship and all of the suffering, there was like no mention of America at all. Like it was all portrayed as like a reflection of the deep tension between left and right that existed in Chile in the early 1970s, right? So it's like their understanding of that coup was as a reflection of like the divided sort of state that Chilean society found itself in the early 1970s. Whereas on the outside, you just kind of hear it as something that like Nixon kind of like willed into existence because of whatever, right? And so that is just, that has always sort of like made me a little, I think that, we should not be too quick to sort of like rob the agency of independent countries, right? Like we should not always sort of frame independent countries as just being the playthings of sort of larger, more powerful states. I think that can be quite sort of paternalistic and reductive. And, they can also obviously be anti-American in its own way when it sort of portrays America as this kind of like uniquely sort of sinister force in the world. A lot of the traditional kind of understanding of U.S.-backed coups in Latin and South America was also sort of, like that was very much something that existed in a kind of Cold War frame, which is the idea like America being afraid of communist governments emerging in Latin and South America, and then thus supporting kind of like right-wing sort of military governments to prevent the emergence of communist governments. And obviously that frame doesn't really exist anymore. But a lot of people still have a kind of muscle memory of that. And so whenever they see a coup in that part of the world, their first instinct is to assume that there must be some sort of hidden American hand willing it into existence.
I've only read one Zizek book.
Yeah.
But he has this great point of just like Western, or like the American ego works both ways, in which some Americans see themselves as like the arbiter or the moral power of the world, and then some can only center the world's folly on America. They only see like, oh, this has to be like America has to be the villain here. America has to be the problem. If it's like, like you're saying that there's these, obviously there's tensions playing out within Honduras or within Chile that has nothing to do with America, but because we're involved, or because America's involved slightly, it has to be like, oh, it's only America's fault. It's entirely our fault. It's the same sort of like, what's the term? Western centrism, West centrism. Yeah. It's the same thing playing out.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great observation by old Zizek. It's true. Yeah, sort of like. And it's sort of paternalistic in the same sort of way, right? Like that you assume that like it's kind of like a leftist reverse engineering of a kind of sort of colonialist kind of like mentality, like that these sort of people who live in the third world or the developing world are kind of sort of simple-minded, weak people who cannot sort of run their own affairs, cannot have political opinions of their own. They only are what we in some way kind of like wish them to be through our propaganda and through our, you know, covert funding and our sort of nefarious schemes with the CIA or whatever. Like these people are powerless to resist. They only do what we want them to do. And yeah, I think that's very sort of condescending. And again, it's just like, I don't think that when you actually go to those countries themselves or talk to their own people, they don't necessarily sort of see the world in that way.
Translates to Mexico so far from government.
It's like, for example, like imagine if there was like a
States.
coup in Canada tomorrow, right? Like we would sort of think of it as reflecting, as Canadians, we would think it as primarily as a reflection of something that was going on in our existing society. I don't think our first thought would be to sort of imagine like what were the external forces pressuring it to happen.
Yeah.
Oh, you got a comment here from a it's the famous quote about pity poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to America.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, I'm not sure who said it. It's a very famous line though.
I mean, if there was a coup tomorrow, JJ, if there was a coup in Canada tomorrow, it would be because that Trudeau is Canada's Biden and that Polyev is Canada's Trump. So it'd be America's fault.
It would be. Well, we would sort of say like, oh, the Americans couldn't handle a leader as progressive and enlightened as Justin Trudeau. They had to nip that one in the bud, you know. This is what like Noam Chomsky, you know, the leftist philosopher, used to always sort of say, is that America could not allow the threat of a good example to emerge, and that was the only reason why America hated communism, because America was afraid of seeing communism succeed.
I think it's so tragic that who was I talking about this with? I was talking about this with Nick in the studio. Net loss.
One of the new members.
One of the new members.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I never met him. I went to high school with him. He's an old friend.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, we're talking about this. Did you watch the Colbert Trudeau interview?
No, I couldn't bring myself to. It was too painful.
It was pretty rough. I mean, look, from the amount that there was like 3 minutes spent on Canadian bacon, you know, like that level of just like lowbrow fucking nonsense. But this idea that Polyev is like characterizes Canada's Trump, and that's the only context in which he's known to Americans. Is like, oh, there's like, you know, U.S. has their Trump and Canada has their Trump, and it's Pierre Polyev, and it's so fucking stupid. It's like they're so different. They're nothing alike.
Yeah. No, and Pierre like very clearly like resents people even asking him to talk about Trump or express opinions on Trump, right? Like it's not relevant to his political project at all. I'll make a prediction though, Brogan. I bet you if Kamala Harris gets in America and then Pierre gets in Canada, I bet you there will be a faction of Americans that will come to really like Pierre. Like they will come to sort of imagine him as like the cool based leader of this continent, and then Kamala Harris being their lame president, and they'll sort of be like, oh man, wish we lived in Canada. Canada's prime minister is so cool, unlike our lame left wing horrible Democrat woman president. That's my prediction.
It's probably
hard to imagine.
It's good. That's probably a good prediction.
It's hard to imagine Pierre and it'll become relevant what you just brought up if Trump gets elected and then Pierre gets elected, right? And sort of like those two men being the leaders of North America and what their relationship would be like, because there'll be a lot of pressure on Pierre to not do anything that sort of portrays him as being sort of a second banana to Trump or being unduly sort of subordinate to Trump. So I think it's very possible that they could have a pretty bad relationship because Pierre will be under a lot of domestic pressure to stand up to Trump and stand up to America more broadly.
I know. I don't understand, what even, you know, I mean, I feel like I know a decent amount of his policy. I haven't got into, like, the nitty-gritty of his potential policy, but I don't even know where they're drawing the comparison. What pisses me off about Pierre is that, I mean, it's I guess it's like he's playing to the base of sort of like that the mega that is in Canada. Like, I've received emails from the Conservative Party about talking about, like, the WEF. And like woke, and I'm like, look, I don't want to fucking hear any politician say those words. That really drives me insane because it's just so irrelevant. But even like, you know, immigration, for example, like it's like Trump's biggest issue. Pierre is completely pro-immigration. He's never expressed any sentiment against immigration or against like the idea of like Canada being this perfect like culturally coherent country without immigration, and we need to cut back immigration. Like he's never said that once.
Yeah. He's not talking about mass deportations. He's not talking about Haitians eating the cats and the dogs, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard nothing about that, and I don't understand why. Like I feel like in the studio or like even I receive a lot of pushback on like I support Paul. Like I'm gonna vote Poilievre.
Yeah.
And I'm not dying to. I'm not like in love with him. I'm pretty like moot on most politicians, but he just seems like the obvious choice in the next election.
Yeah.
And I don't understand where the pushback comes from. For me, it's like I feel like people are mischaracterizing him as this guy who is going to potentially change like abortion laws or like gay marriage, stuff like that, like stuff people attribute to Trump. And like it's like the Canadian politics are nothing like that. I feel like it's a completely I think it's just mischaracterizing what Canadian politics are.
But this is sort of like what I was saying before about like, the challenges that democracy faces, right? Is like people are just not taking their duties as voters as seriously as they should. They just kind of like imagine a politician in their mind and then they vote against that imaginary version of the politician, right? So there's a lot of people on the left in this country who kind of have just made up what they think Pierre is, what they kind of like imagine a conservative candidate for prime minister would be like, and they imagine that in sort of like the most hostile way possible. They imagine him as a kind of like, demonic, far-right, terrible social conservative guy. And then they vote against that imaginary person rather than actually bothering to like learn and give the person a fair shot and like, figure out what he's actually campaigning on and what he's actually promising to do. And I don't know, that just seems very irresponsible as a citizen. And the other thing, too, is I think that, it's very obvious that there's a lot of problems with this country right now. Like, there are some serious, economic problems. There's problems with crime. Like, there's a lot of significant stuff that's not working out well for your average Canadian right now. And to just kind of like hand wave away people's legitimate concerns that they have with the state of Canada in order to sort of like justify voting against the only guy who, as far as I'm concerned, is actually attempting to offer a new direction for this country, because like you've imagined some magical scenario in which he's going to ban abortion or something, that also seems very irresponsible and wrong-headed. And that's why, I don't know, like left-wingers in Canada, like, I don't know, I'd have no problem voting for Kamala Harris in America, but the left in this country is just so much less serious. They have a much worse governing record than the Democrats do in the States. So, and I wish that more left-wing Canadians would be called out for this. Like left-wing Canadians on some level, progressive Canadians, they have to own the legacy of Trudeau. Trudeau has been in power for 10 years. For the last, 4 years, he's been explicitly propped up by the NDP. So you can't even use the excuse, like NDPers can't even use the excuse that they didn't want this. Their party has been explicitly supporting Justin Trudeau's government. So, own up to it. Like, tell me what this Trudeau government has done that's been so great that we cannot afford to have a conservative government instead. And a lot of left-wing people in Canada are just very cowardly in a way that I think progressives in America are not. Progressives in America will proudly defend the Biden record, especially when contrasted to what Trump's promising. But it's much harder to get a sort of progressive Canadian to do that.
Yeah, I don't know, it's bizarre. We are in a weird, very strange position. Even I don't know if I was talking to you about. I don't know really. It's a bleed over from American politics, but I was at Wasaga Beach in Ontario, and I think I sent you a picture actually of the amount of this guy with the "fuck Trudeau" flags on his giant truck, right? And he had like 4 of them, and he just drove in circles around the parking lot the whole time, right? And there's like the other side of it is it's like how divide. I don't know if it's like division or I don't know. I mean, honestly, Canadian politics really confuse me in a way that like American politics don't. American politics seems to like very binary, very like cut and dry, and Canadian politics just don't. I feel like maybe Canadians want to LARP, to use that term, the way American politics actually have like potential huge ramifications. If Trump has never been clear on if he's going to veto a federal abortion ban. Even if you saw like he did that on his Truth Social thing, because he was asked in the interview, he didn't explicitly answer the question yes or no. JD Vance was asked, didn't explicitly answer it, and then he made a post on Truth Social, and he says, Of course, it's all capitals. Or no, sorry, it was Twitter. You can probably pull the tweet up. Of course, I would veto a federal abortion ban. Next sentence. I've always said it should be up to the states. And I'm like, okay, so that's still not a clear answer, because you're saying it's like in one breath you're saying I veto it, and then you're saying it's always up to the states. So that's like still up in the air. That's not Canadian politics at all. But I feel like Canadians really want that, like, potential huge social changes to be on the line, which they just aren't.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, and I think your analysis of it is entirely correct. Especially sort of people in kind of like our world, right? Like when it comes to like what people want to debate, what people want to discuss, they want to discuss the big sort of sexy, polarizing, and sort of like morally divisive issues. They don't want to talk about sort of like, simple questions about taxes and how we stimulate economic growth and sort of things like that, right? They want to talk about these big sort of sexy moral issues. And American politics just has a lot more of those. Like the American political sort of system with its sort of two-party binary, it sort of sorts people into very clear camps and sort of allows things like the Jubilee thing that you were referencing earlier to sort of exist, where there's like a very sort of clear sense that the right and the left are sort of battling it out on these very high profile issues that are being adjudicated through the American presidential system and through Congress and through the courts and all the rest of it. And that's just very, like you said before, like it's very dopaminergic stuff in a way that Canadian politics is not. I mean, I think it can be. I'm somebody that's obviously been talking about Canadian politics my whole life, and I've gotten into a lot of trouble, and I've become a polarizing figure, and I've had a lot of sort of vigorous and stimulating debates. So those debates can be found, but at the end of the day, like that takes more work, and I think people would rather, even Canadians would just rather pretend like that our politics exists to adjudicate questions of immigration and abortion and gay rights and all the rest, even though it doesn't. It exists to adjudicate other questions because, in part, like it or not, like a lot of those questions that are still live issues in America have been, quote unquote, settled to a much higher degree in Canada. And that also, it's not just because Canadians are more enlightened, it's because, the Canadian political system is different, and in some ways it's a less democratic system that gives less political power to the guy with the fuck Trudeau flags than, the MAGA crew have in the States, through things like primary voting and all of that. But, these are the realities that we have to exist in as Canadians, and it can be frustrating that a lot of Canadians don't seem to want to respect them.
Yeah. Who do you think the worst prime minister is? Explaining
prime minister.
Yeah, explaining to somebody who I basically my entire knowledge of Canadian politics has been like as long as I've been alive.
Yeah.
So, I'd like to hear your I like to hear your observation of like when the country, because I feel like I have this opinion, especially like hearing Nick Fuentes or Sneeko or like any of the people in my wheelhouse of like internet politics talk about the US when they're like when they say that like 2024 is uniquely the fucking worst time for the US ever, and never have things ever been this bad. And I'm like, no, that's not the case. Like, there's been many worse parts of the US and in different cities at many different times, right? So I feel like I have that perspective, but like in Canada, I don't have that perspective at all. So is there a point to look back to where it's like, okay, Canada was like far, far, far worse objectively at this point, and now, although things seem like they've gotten worse in the last like 4 years, it's not that bad comparatively.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, like Canada was like a very, like compared to the US, like a very poor country until, relatively recently, right? Like Canada did not have like a strong economy in the way that the US did. Like we benefited a lot from the post-war economic boom. That was when Canada was really sort of developed at a sort of like massive scale. Before then, in sort of like the late 19th century, we also sort of went a belated economic boom in sort of those days. But yeah, again, like nothing compared to the US. And then we had sort of, it wasn't until the 1980s that we had free trade with America, which also sort of created a sort of like large economic boom. But it's like, like the Canada of like my dad's or like our families grew up in. Like my dad was born in 1948, and it's like you grow up in Canada in sort of the late 1940s or, before, like you imagine like the 30s or the 20s or, the early 20th century, and like Canada was just not a great place. Like it was poor, it was not very economically influential in world affairs. People had a much lower sort of standard of living than they do now. This is why there was constantly massive immigration out of Canada into America, where there was just so many more opportunities. Like all of sort of like a lot of the great sort of Canadian sort of inventors and sort of figures that we like to take credit for, were often people that couldn't get out of Canada fast enough because there was just so much more opportunity. And this was the case for most of the first half of the 20th century. So, and Canada was obviously very hard hit by the Great Depression, and that was a sort of terrible time for the country as well. So many people out of work and unemployed. Canada in the 1960s, there was, French Canadian terrorism that caused a lot of problems, and that was a really difficult time for the country as well. When Pierre Elliott Trudeau first came to power in 1968, there was so I was talking about this on my stream last night. People were asking me about the French Canadian terrorism and what that was sort of like. So that was like a very dark time for the country. But I don't know, like there's, and now like Canada sort of since, I'd say like since the 80s, like you sort of like the Canadian sort of climate that people like me grew up in was just such a much, much more prosperous time for Canada than we've ever known before. Like I'm so happy that I grew up when I did, right? Because like to grow up in Canada of previous decades, you were just born into a much like poorer, much more economically stagnant country in which there was just much fewer jobs, much lower wages, much less things to buy, a much lower standard of living relative to the US. Whereas in recent years, we've come much more closer to achieving parity with the US in terms of what average life is like. So I don't know, that's kind of a pretty broad answer to the question. I mean, like when it comes to like who was the worst prime minister, like the sort of the canonical answer, you can see I have my little chart of Canadian prime ministers just in the back there. But like the canonical answer is probably like Richard Bruce Bennett, R.B. Bennett, who was prime minister during the Great Depression. He's sort of like widely regarded as having been a uniquely bad prime minister. Like a lot of people don't like Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I mean, I like him. I've come to respect him a lot more. But, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was prime minister from 1968 to 1984, he presided over a time in which Canada had a very poorly performing economy. Inflation was very high. Wages were low. Unemployment was high. Like that was a very difficult time for a lot of Canadians. So that wasn't a particularly great time for the country. And whenever they do surveys, like a lot of people will rank him as being quite a bad prime minister, even though I think that his governing record was vindicated by other things.
Interesting. I've always heard that he was for my father always said he was the best prime minister.
Yeah.
He was he was his favorite.
He was like I think that there's a lot to be said for Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Like he was the guy that sort of secured Canada's final independence from Great Britain in 1982. That was a significant achievement. He created the Charter of Rights and Freedoms into the Canadian Constitution, which I think has made all of our lives better and was objectively a good thing. The fact that it took until 1982 to have, civil rights enshrined in the Canadian Constitution, I think that's kind of bizarre in retrospect that it took that long. And and he made Canada famous on the world stage. He threw his weight around a lot. He got Canada into the G7, into the Group of Seven, which is one of the most elite diplomatic groups in the world, and that sort of gave us a lot of diplomatic power of a way we didn't have previously. So there was a lot of good things that he did, and there was a lot of ways in which through just sort of sheer force of character and will as a product of his personality, that he sort of demanded praise and demanded to be loved and demanded to be sort of seen as a man of great consequence. And I think that's why a lot of people sort of had a natural sort of inclination to defer to him and his achievements. But at the same time, like I said, economically, Canada did not perform well during his tenure, and it wasn't, I think, until sort of the boom years of the 80s and the 90s, once he had sort of shuffled off, that Canada really sort of came into its own as a very wealthy, very prosperous country, the country that we all sort of take for granted as being the normal of Canadian life. I think that is something that a lot of people don't realize how late that came. And I think that Pierre Elliott Trudeau bears some responsibility for the reason why it came as late as it did.
Yeah, I mean, even growing up in Nova Scotia, Halifax had the highest murder rate in the country for a couple years in the early 2000s. And I remember this always getting this perspective of, I mean, it's where I grew up. I think probably Nova Scotia would have been one of the last places to receive any sort of economic benefit, or like to modernize, the last to modernize, along with Newfoundland. And yeah, I really got that opinion, especially from my mom and who grew up in Halifax, of like how kind of like dirty and poor Halifax was, and how dirty and poor the rest of the province was, which is still true to an extent. Very, very poor province, but Halifax specifically is kind of starting to receive the benefits of that Toronto or Calgary or Vancouver has gotten over the last 10 years. People are wanting to move there, start businesses there. To the detriment of people who have lived there their whole lives, who are now getting priced out of homes there. But you know, it's starting to happen, at least in Halifax.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's remarkable. Like, you think of, like, we think of sort of Atlantic Canada as being like an economically sort of depressed part of the country, and you know, it is. But like, you imagine like what it would have been like to live in that part of the country when things were so much worse. Like, you imagine what life would have been like, you know, in the 1940s or 30s or, you know, 20s or something like that, living in these parts of the country where the economy is just very simple. You know, it's based around like fishing and like nothing else. And yeah, it was pretty rough. Like, there's a reason why like all of the big sort of technological and cultural innovations of the 20th century happened in America and didn't happen in Canada. There's a reason why, you know, just as simple as this, like, there's a reason why Canada's population is 10 times lower than America's. It's not just because Canada's colder, it's because Canada was a much, much less attractive place to emigrate to. You know, there's a reason why all of the immigrants from Europe, you know, chose to live in the US and not Canada. And frankly, even a reason why a lot of immigrants who came to Canada would move south, right? Along with many other native-born Canadians who would move south. So yeah, the economic realities of Canadian history is, I think, a very sort of like underrated sort of topic that more Canadians should research and know about. Because I think there's a kind of assumption that because, you know, Canada is a sort of like rich American sort of style country today, that we've always sort of been that way, or that this current outcome was in some ways inevitable and was, as opposed to being the result of very specific policy decisions that I think were made in the late 20th century.
How do you think Canada does better? You know, just does better. We're the second largest country. We're rich with natural resources. What is stopping us from, you know, what's the difference in GDP between, it's like $20,000, like what's Canada's GDP per capita average, like 50K, 48K, something like that? I believe the US is 70K.
Yeah, it's something like that. I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sure you saw that chart that was going around with all of the states. There was another chart actually that was going around the other day of the. Did you see this one of the median sort of wage in Canada versus the U.S.?
No, I'd love to see that. I know the one that you posted on your Twitter.
Yeah, of the different states, right?
Yeah, that was Nova Scotia was the lowest in North America, or between Canada and the U.S. Nova Scotia was the worst.
Here's another chart that's similar. This one is about median employment earnings. So if I send this to you through the, what should I send it to you through? Through the Discord chat?
Yeah, the Discord chat.
Okay, take a look at this one.
What do we got here? So let me go to my full screen there. So number one's Maryland.
Yeah.
Workers in every Canadian province earn less than
median,
workers.
Yeah, so this is like median employment earnings. So this means like, you know, there's an equal number of people that make less and make more. So, yeah, so 52K is like the median in the richest state. And then the median in the poorest state which is Prince Edward Island, is 28K.
USD.
A year.
Wow.
Yeah. You see, that's a pretty broad.
Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, 32, 32, yeah. 30. PEI's 28. That's baffling. That's wild, I can't believe Alberta. Wait, Ontario's 36. Alberta's 38. Fuck me. No, I know. I mean, it's absurd. It's absurd. Like, you know, I was just in Miami, and it's like, I understand the dollar is different and prices are different, but it's like I'm going to Starbucks and I'm getting a large black coffee, and the number is the same as it is in Toronto, but it's 30% more because it's USD, and I get the charge on my my phone on my Amex app that says $9.20 for a black coffee, right? It's just like, it's insane that it's the same. Like, we're so close. And Toronto is such an expensive city. There's so many expensive cities in Canada, and we're just not earning that much money. Like, we're so closed off to business. Even being in Miami too. Like, I mean, the amount of wealth in Miami is just like truly. I mean, you were there, right? It's baffling. It's baffling. Like, every car. Did you stay on South Beach when you were there, Miami Beach?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. It's like every other car that drives by is an exotic car, or like a Ferrari or a Rolls Royce. There's an obscene amount of wealth there and prosperity that it doesn't exist even in downtown Toronto. I don't see nearly as much.
Yeah, and see, like, hold on, Brogan, you put your face away.
Oh wait, there we go. Should pop back there in a second.
Okay. Yeah. No, and it's like, this is a very important point, right? And like, this is the challenge that's facing Canada, right? Like, this is what our politics should be about. Our politics should not be about talking about whether or not, you know, Pierre reminds us of Trump, or if Pierre is going to ban abortion, which he obviously is not. It should be, how can we get our economy in better shape? How can we create better paying jobs for Canadians that can then keep pace with the extraordinarily high standard or cost of living in this country, right? Like, we have this massive gap between prices and wages in Canada. And it's just like, that should be priority number one, to get that sorted out. How we can foster greater economic growth, how we can make the cost of living more affordable for more Canadians, and all this kind of stuff. Like, this might not be as sexy as debating, you know, January 6th or whatever, but it's like, this is what's on our plate as Canadians, and we have to have a political conversation that addresses these very real problems, because otherwise nothing's going to get done, right? Like, if you just sort of debate American politics and then vote based on vibes, you know, you're not doing your duty as an engaged citizen. And it's troubling, because then I think you continue to sort of see a cycle in which, you know, the Canadian economy, underperforms. And I mean, it seems like the underperforming is actually getting quite bad now. Like, I can show you another chart that I was actually just looking at when I was looking for that chart.
Aren't we we're the worst G7 nation, aren't we, for economy?
Yeah, well, I mean, by some metrics, it depends exactly what you're looking at. But there has been a big divergence now, like a very significant gap in GDP per capita comparing to Canada and the US, of a sort that has been sort of steadily widening. Let me show you this one here. This is from one of the top economists in this country, Trevor Tome. Yeah, so see, look at this one here.
This is real GDP per capita.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
So you can see how, like, even though, like, obviously we were just talking about sort of Canada's economic history and how there's always been a significant gap between the two places, you can see that the gap is actually now starting to widen really dramatically. And a lot of it sort of, you know, correlates, I'm sorry to say, with, like, this is part of Trudeau's economic legacy, right? Is that the gap has gotten wider. And you notice too, when you look at this chart, the viewers can't see it because your face is blocking it, Brogan.
Wow, there we go. I can pull it up there.
Yeah. So anyway, you sort of see that, like, the way that things have traditionally gone in Canadian history is that even though there's a gap between the two countries' GDP, you know, basically the arrow is still going up. You know, the Canadian arrow is still going up, even as the US arrow sort of exceeds us. But you're seeing now that in the Trudeau years, basically, you're sort of seeing that our economic growth has just kind of flatlined. Like, it's stagnant. It's not rising in sync with the US line. So as a result, the gap that always exists is now getting wider, and it's scheduled to get as wide as it's ever been. And so it's like, how do we deal with this? What is our strategy for sort of narrowing that gap? And a lot of the economic growth that we are experiencing now is being driven by your favorite topic, immigration, right? Like, Canada has not all of, but like a large amount of Canada's economic growth, to the degree we're experiencing any economic growth at all, is coming simply through immigration. And immigration is kind of like the sugar high of economic growth, right? It gives you a sort of like short-term boost, but obviously you can't keep immigrating, or you can't keep welcoming infinite number of immigrants forever. We're starting to reach our sort of limit of that. And then so sort of once the immigration sugar high wears off, what else does the government have to resort to? The Trudeau government has done a lot in terms of, and I'm going to sound like a sort of tendentious right-winger when I say this, but the Trudeau government has done a lot of growth of government, which also can kind of boost GDP. If the size of government grows, that can increase the GDP or creating new jobs that way and so forth. But, there's obviously a limit to that too. So the question is really how we create more high-paying private sector jobs in this country. And it seems to me that this is an issue that we're not debating nearly as much as we should.
No, I mean, exactly. The issue with, Canada has, it seems to me that Canada has not received any benefits from immigration over the past whenever the student visa craze started, 4 or 5 years. Yeah. We're stretching the same GDP thinner, and you're basically creating the lowest wage, the lowest class of Canadians are competing with immigrants for the lowest class of job. If it's service work or gig economy, fast food, uneducated factory workers, things like that. But it's baffling too, because we have the resources to justify having a giant skilled labor market. It's we're not a resource poor country. We're not a small country. Yeah. We have so much to potentially offer the world, and it's my lack of knowledge on the topic, but I'm just completely unsure why we are not capitalizing on it. If we have the systems in place to do so, if we could be analogous to the US, why aren't we? It's not just what do we have as far as Social Security? I guess I don't know. Besides free healthcare, even that's eating up so much tax dollars, right? I like taxes. I like paying taxes. I'm not anti-tax, but for Alberta to have higher taxes than California, and for every province in the country to have higher taxes than California, where is that going?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it is going to healthcare, I'm sorry to say. Healthcare is, they sometimes talk about it, it's sort of like the Pac-Man in the budgetary pie chart, its mouth is just closing because it's using up more and more resources, as the population gets older and as we refuse to allow any aspect of the healthcare system to be privatized in any way, there's obviously a cost that comes to that. A lot of Canadians work for the government as well, and government benefits for government workers, that those continue to sort of expand, and that has a price as well. Taxpayers have to foot that bill as well, and and then there's other things that the government has to make commitments to. The Canadian government is under enormous pressure from our international allies to spend more money on our armed forces. That takes a toll. There's lots of different things that are, so you kind of just, but spending, high spending government is fine as long as you have a sort of expanding tax base to sort of keep pace with it. And that's just the sort of thing that we don't have. We're just not seeing the kind of growth that we would need in the economy in order to sort of keep pace with the kind of generous state that a lot of Canadians sort of feel entitled to. And that, it's true. There is a sort of moment of reckoning that's going to come. And that's why I'm excited for Pierre to be prime minister, not because I'm just some sort of knee-jerk partisan who just, wants conservatives to be elected for their own sake, but because, I've spent, some time with Pierre. I've gotten a chance to talk to him and talk to people in his inner circle. And I do have a sort of sense that this new crop of politicians that's going to come to power in Ottawa perceives the magnitude of the challenge that's facing them and are willing to do dramatic action in some cases to attempt to course correct, whether that includes aggressive deregulation of certain industries, expansion of trade and free trade with America, authorization of new natural resource projects of the sort that, a progressive government would be sort of too skittish to allow. There's a lot of ways in which a Pierre-led government, I think, would be willing to sort of do the kind of aggressive acts that I think a timid government like Trudeau's is just not interested in temperamentally and not interested in ideologically. So I think that Pierre does represent, the best hope we have to kind of kick this country into a new gear and get it out of its sort of cycle of complacency.
No, we could be great.
Could be great. He could not be. He could flop too, but I think there's reason to be optimistic and to at least hope and give him a chance to try something different.
You should do a camp. I was watching Destiny's stream today. He's doing something in Wisconsin with, I don't know, I actually didn't know the context of the stream at all, but I was talking about how much they canvassed for the election runoff, for the Senate runoff after the 2020 election, how much his Discord and his community canvassed.
Yeah, he's been dining out on that one for a while.
But I think it's inspiring though. It's inspiring that you could, you can mobilize.
No, it's nice. It's nice.
You can mobilize. You have a giant. How big's your Discord server? Like 4,000 people?
I don't know. I'm not a big Discord guy, but
that's where it all happens. I'm telling you, you gotta.
Is that so? Gotta Discord more?
I know. I mean, Destiny's is 100,000.
100,000.
100,000 people. Wow. I'm telling you.
No, it's true, and it's like, I mean, you make a good point, right? Because we all, like, politics is not just talking on the internet. Politics is not just live streams and debates and arguments online. Like, politics is action, and it's action to improve your community and to ensure that, the right sort of decisions are being made and the wrong ones are not. And that does require, like, action and accountability as well, right? And I think that part of the way that you express that sense of accountability is by being comfortable endorsing politicians, right? Like, I'm comfortable saying that, I want Pierre Poilievre to win. I want him to be prime minister. I hope that people vote conservative. And I've actually been sort of like thinking, like, that's sort of something that like kind of comes up in casual conversation, and maybe like I allude to it in passing in a video or two. But I have been sort of thinking of like, does it behoove me to like make a formal endorsement and like really sort of come out explicitly and say, this is what I think my viewers should do, and this is why. I've been thinking about this specifically in the context of we're having an election right here in British Columbia, and I think, again, it's important that people vote conservative here in British Columbia, because I think that our current NDP liberal duopoly that's been running this country or this province for the last 20 years or so, like, I think that they're played out, and we need a new course of action here. So I've been thinking, like, does it behoove me to make like a formal endorsement and tell people to vote and support and canvass for and volunteer for the Conservative Party? Being explicit like that can make people feel a little icky sometimes, because people don't like that level of accountability. But at the same time, like, if you truly care about what politics is, which is, bettering your community, bettering the life for your fellow citizens, then you kind of have to be willing to do it. Otherwise, you're not really engaging in politics. You're just doing a kind of entertainment.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree 100%. I wouldn't be against it. I feel pretty adamantly about voting for Poilievre and encouraging my audience to do so as well, whenever the election may be. Isn't there? I know the carbon thing passed. What is the deal with the potential December election? If the bloc, isn't there something with the bloc and like something happening in December?
I don't think so. Well, I'm like, initially, like, the previous sort of story of the last couple of weeks was that the Bloc Québécois had like a line in the sand in regards to the Liberal government, which is that they wanted to get the old age sort of security age lowered. It used to be 65. Harper heightened it to 75, and they wanted it to be lowered back to 65. And the Trudeau government said, no, I'm not interested in that. And then the Bloc Québécois sort of said, well, we'll vote non-confidence in you if you don't support that. And the other day, there was a vote in the Parliament on this very issue, and the NDP bloc and Conservatives all voted in favor of it. So it passed despite Liberal opposition, which is the kind of thing that doesn't happen that much in our parliamentary system. So, I guess that issue has now been resolved. So I think that was previously like the deadline, was that the Bloc Québécois sort of said, like, I think that's probably what you're referring to, like that was their December deadline. Like, they wanted that issue to be resolved before December, but now it's already been resolved. So that kind of takes it off the table.
Okay.
So
yeah. I think it was just that.
Yeah. They'd have to find a new line in the sand to draw. But the thing is that, like, this is the difficult math, and this is kind of the black pill of the whole situation, is that all of the opposition parties have to agree. So it's not good enough, because of just the way that the math works in the parliament, is that it's not good enough that the Liberals, or sorry, it's not good enough that the Conservatives and the Bloc are on the same page, or the Bloc and the NDP are on the same page, or the Conservatives and the NDP are on the same page. All three of those parties have to be unified, because otherwise, mathematically, they cannot trigger an early election. And I think it's a little blackpilly, just in the sense that I think it's kind of hard to imagine a scenario in which all three of those parties view their interests as being aligned, because the NDP is just so far down in the polls that, it's in no way obvious that they would benefit from an election. And, the Bloc Québécois, I guess they're going to keep their eye on the Quebec numbers and how well they're doing there. And then the Conservatives are just so ahead in the polls that they want an election at any time. So I don't know. A lot of it comes down to, like, at what point will the NDP believe it will be in their partisan interests to have an election? And given that the NDP has never won an election or even come close to winning an election in Canadian history, I think there's a strong argument to be made that, there's no good time for the NDP to trigger an early election.
So your professional opinion is that the election is going to happen when it's supposed to happen. Was it late next year?
Yeah, it's like, I think it's October of 2025. So, I mean, I would like, if we were doing like the Family Feud over under, I would definitely believe like it'll be much closer to late 2025 than early 2025. But, stranger things have happened, and, the NDP, at the end of the day, like, the NDP is like bad at politics. And so you cannot take it for granted that they'll necessarily do the most rational thing. So they might trigger an early election for some reason that doesn't really make sense. But I think that if I'm giving the NDP the benefit of the doubt and assuming that they will do what's in their partisan interest to do, I think that, a later election is probably in the cards.
Damn, it sucks.
Yeah, I agree. Because we want to get this. We want to, it's just another year, just like another wasted year. Like, this country, can't endure much more of this.
No, man, I just want something to happen. For my entire voting life, Trudeau has been in power. I've never had the opportunity to vote for prime minister. So
really,
yeah, think about that. I'm 26. I've never voted for a prime minister.
You've only lived in. See, like, this is interesting, because like this comes up a lot in the American sort of discourse as well. Is like how many like young people just think of like Trump's leadership of the Republican Party as being just kind of like default. It's like Trump is what a Republican is, and then anybody who's like older has a sort of sense of Trump as being a sort of aberration. Like, Trump is not normal. And it is kind of interesting to sort of think about that, like how your perspective on politics is just so heavily informed by what you grew up witnessing, So, yeah, that's wild to me, because I think of Trudeau as like, I think of him as, I don't know, I've seen many prime ministers come and go now at being 40. And I don't even think of him as being a particularly good liberal prime minister. Like, when I compare him to the other liberal prime ministers that I've witnessed in my life, like, he seems worse than them. But yeah, there's a lot of young people that will be growing up in the same way that there's a lot of like young conservatives in America who think that republicanism is what Trump is. A lot of young progressives in Canada think that progressive politics in Canada is what Justin Trudeau is.
I mean, I guess it's, for people my age, the same thing, I guess, in the U.S. of, if you're my age, you would have voted, if you were exactly my age, you would have voted for Trump in 2016, and that's your only understanding of, what a Republican is Trump.
Yeah, and like this is something that worries a lot of progressives in particular, a lot of Democrats in particular, is that if Trump gets back in, it will in part be because he has made inroads with young men in particular, young men of all races. And there's like just a lot of young men that like what Trump is pitching, because I think in some ways, like sort of this kind of like right-wing stuff that we all talk about and witness and all that is like very targeted to appeal to, well, maybe it's not targeted to appeal, but it does have a sort of natural resonance with young men, and that young men can be mobilized to vote in a presidential election in a way they might not be mobilized to vote in other elections, and not only mobilized to vote in a presidential election, but mobilized to vote for Trump in particular. And that's kind of troubling to me, as somebody that identifies, I'm not a young man myself, but I like young people, and I'm very interested in what they're up to, and I want to sort of play a role in the lives of young people. And it's distressing to me to think of how many young men in America sort of look at Trump and see this is a desirable president, when to me, as somebody who is a larger sort of context and can remember a much more competent and respectable conservative party, to kind of think that like this is now what a lot of young people are going to be, culturated to believe is the essence of conservatism. Like it's really disturbing, not just for the possibility of Trump becoming president again, but for the possibility of this just being sort of the permanent sort of like orientation of what conservatism is. And that will have consequences in Canada as well. Like I think that like when you're talking about the fuck Trudeau flags and that, and even like some of Trudeau Pierre's style, like it's very clearly influenced by a kind of sense of public demand, and what sort of people want, and what people seem to want is a kind of conservatism that is much more about kind of like culture war type of stuff, that is much more unapologetically crude and combative and rude and mean and confrontational and nasty and conspiratorial. And that's not a positive development for political culture.
No, it's awful. It's awful. I mean, like, look, if Trump wins, like, you could take a 13-year-old who would have, a 13-year-old in 2015 when Trump won the primary. If Trump wins this election, is going to be, 26. So from 13 to 26, from like basically having no concept of the world outside of their like childhood to being a 26-year-old man, their only concept of right-wing politics or Republican politics in the U.S. is Trump. And it's, like the whole thing is just, I'm so fucking excited for this era to just be over. Yeah. I just want to move on. Like when I saw, even now on Twitter with like, I don't know if you saw this because it was very brief. He deleted this tweet immediately, but Elon Musk tweeted, "Interesting how no one's tried to assassinate Kamala." Right? Oh, yeah. I remember reading that while it was still up, and I was like, I cannot fucking believe that like this is the timeline I live in.
Yeah.
Right? I just want to move on. I'm so sad. It's exhausting to see.
It is exhausting. And I'm sure you saw as well, like, Elon was with Trump today at his big rally in Pennsylvania. It's exhausting. It's frustrating. It's, America is better than this. Like, America has so much more potential than this. Like, we want to see America thrive and succeed and be a great country and be an inspiring country to the world, and all of this. And it's just so depressing to think of like another wasted 4 years with Trump, because like what I'm realizing more and more is like, Trump will commit crimes. Trump will have a corrupt government, but Trump will also just have an incredibly incompetent government. It'll be racked by scandal and infighting and all these lunatics that will be in the White House with him. And it's just going to be just depressing and upsetting for anybody that cares about the future of America. And I just really just don't want to endure it. And that's why, like, I think Kamala Harris's slogan, like, we're not going back, like, that's a good slogan, because I think all Americans should not want to go back to that. And it's just depressing to me to think of how many, and again, like this, it's a very gendered problem. Like it's men that are keeping Trump popular, and it's young men in particular that are being drawn to Trump for the first time and are sort of swelling his popularity. And it's just like, I don't know what to make of that, but it's, as a man myself, and as somebody that cares about like young men in particular, it's like, what do you say to that? Like, what's gone wrong with us?
I mean, I guess young people feeling young men feeling a lack of meaning, or a lack of a future, of a normal future. Not just like this prospect that we're all gonna be millionaires someday, but just starting a family, owning a home, having a steady job. It seems up in the air, and I think just even, Trump speaks to that, literally, and I think just the perspective, the optics of, someone being like, I understand your problems, I understand that, like, you are, there's a growing group of disenfranchised young men that has been growing for the last 8 years, and just pointing it out, at the very least, pointing it out is winning a lot of people over, which it seems like a lot of left-wing people don't want to point it out, or it seems optically bad to point it out. It seems like you're playing into this sort of this fantasy of like the downtrodden young man who is not getting what he deserves as a white young man in America. It's like, well, no, at the end of the day, like, you know, everyone wants the opportunity to just like have a normal fucking life, and by not mentioning it, you're harming it.
I mean, like, I would be more partial to kind of like that theory if it was like J.D. Vance who was like running for president, right? Like J.D. Vance, who for all of his problems is, you know, a more intelligent man who I think has a more kind of like holistic theory of some of the stuff that you described about, you know, the deprivations of the white working class and the left behind young white men and all this kind of stuff. But it's like you listen to a Trump rally, it's like he doesn't talk about any of this stuff. Like he talks about himself, he talks about how the election was stolen, he talks about how, you know, they are trying to kill me and they are trying to put me in prison. Like it's the politics of personality, it's the politics of a personality cult, it's the politics of the sort of personal sense of aggrievement of one like egomaniacal individual. So like that's what I just don't get. It's like Trump is just so self-evidently not interested in anybody except for himself, and I don't know how anyone can see him as their champion, except to the degree that Trump is an offensive person, and that some men kind of get off on the idea of like Trump triggering people and Trump bothering people, and like, oh, won't it like piss off people if Trump gets back in? And like Trump, like this is the line that Tucker Carlson says, like Trump offends all of the right people. And it's like, that's just such an unserious reason for voting for a president. And it's just, it bothers me a lot that anybody like is just that unserious and like can look at Trump and can like hallucinate that this is a man that's going to get anywhere close to solving any of the problems that they purport to care about.
What's the best case scenario if Trump gets reelected?
Best case scenario?
Yeah, like how do you see that presidency going if it just, you know, if it's innocuous, if he like doesn't fuck with democracy at all, if he gets like, you know, elected normally, officially. I mean, because isn't there something with I listened to a Wall Street Journal thing on this. He's trying to like load the election officials in Georgia.
Yeah.
Yeah, did you read about that?
Yeah, I've followed that a bit. Yeah, there's like some real sort of like MAGA people on the like the Georgia Election Administrative Council.
And a big thing was that he did a rally there, and he like named them in the rally. He was these people, thank you for being here, which is like, why the fuck would anybody name these random officials in their rally?
Yeah. No, there's definitely like there's like some real like MAGA lunatics who have taken control of the election machinery in some states, mostly in just like states that the Republicans are going to win anyway, so it's not really that relevant. But it matters in Georgia just because Georgia is a swing state, and the fact that you've got such partisan people doing what are supposed to be sort of nonpartisan jobs is worrying, right? Like it's always very ironic the degree to which a lot of like MAGA Republicans are doing the very thing that they accuse Democrats of. You know, they say that the election is rigged by Democrats, and yet like the most open pro kind of like rigging type people are on the other side. But no, like best case scenario, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I think that like the best case scenario and like the scenario that I try to, you know, make peace with when I think like if Trump does get elected, how will I not drive myself nuts with depression over it, is I think that like Trump will just lead a very incompetent government. Like I think that Trump will lead a government that will be like corrupt, and it will be like unethical, and it will be run by like lunatics and cranks and sycophants and just MAGA weirdos. But I suspect it will get like very little done. And in the best case scenario, right? And in sort of in that best case scenario, it's just kind of like a period of like stagnation for America, like that the government is too incompetent to do anything big and substantial, but doesn't also maybe do anything that's terribly awful either. And so then Trump's like 4 years just become this like kind of like 4-year clown show, but ultimately doesn't cause too much damage. And then we all just kind of like move on and get on with our lives. And, you know, like Trump himself gets kind of like increasingly senile and old and can't do much. And, you know, maybe isn't seen in public too much near the end, you know, because he'll be in his early 80s, kind of like, you know, like Biden is right now. And
I mean, he's getting old now. He's visibly losing gusto even since the beginning of the campaign.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's like, and we can forget this, right? Because it's like Trump has always been kind of like a blatherer, right? Like he's never been the most articulate of men. But like you look at clips of him from 2016, like when he's debating Hillary Clinton, and my God, he just seems like a, you know, Rhodes Scholar compared to where he is now. So yeah, he's obviously, and the thing too is like his government will be staffed with just such suck-ups, right? Last time his government was staffed with like establishment Republican people, you know, senators and congressmen and governors and, you know, people from the first Bush administration and like that kind of thing, right? But now it's just going to be like full of like just like Fox News weirdos and like influencers and like just the most like suck-uppy politicians who have never known a Republican Party except for Trump. So I think the, like, I'm sorry to say, like the best case scenario is just that like the kind of the drama and the nonsense of MAGA world just distracts and consumes the Trump White House to such an extent that it's not able to like engage in, you know, mass deportations or the suppression of American democratic institutions. It's just too incompetent and too ramshackle to do that. And so, like I said, and then like you just kind of like endure 4 years of that. And then, you know, in 2028, it's like, okay, that was dumb. But now we can finally close the book on the Trump era because, you know, Trump, thank God, cannot run for a third term. So let's just move on with our lives. And hopefully there'll be a saner Republican. Although I think that kind of, if Trump gets back in, like the party will be so melded in his image by that point that like there's not going to be much hope, I think, for a sane Republican anything for like a generation or something. I mean, it's going to be pretty depressing for anybody that craves any sort of principled center-right politics. I mean, you look at how much Trump has purged everybody who was anything less than a sycophant already, you know, between 2016 and 2020. Like, there's very few like normal Republicans left. And you could imagine like another 4 years of that. Like it would be just such a freakish party by that point, and that's pretty miserable. And you think like who would be running in 2028? I think that by like 2028, somebody like J.D. Vance will be seen as like a moderate and a squish, and someone who will have to be marginalized in favor of somebody even more radical and nuts. So,
okay, I have two final questions, and then I'm gonna let you go.
Thank you. I'm getting hungry. I need to get something to eat. Yeah.
You can answer them.
But I appreciate it. It's been fun, Brogan. I'm happy that you've given me a chance to be on your stream and have so much time to blather on.
I want to see you stream. I feel like, you know, you talk a lot about your goal to give people the tools, or at least the framework to educate themselves and to become like more nuanced and deeper thinkers. And I think the way to do that is through, if you really like pragmatically like caring about young people and giving them those tools, it's streaming. Like, this is the avenue, whether you like it or not, this is the avenue that people are going to engage with this stuff now. And the more that you specifically get in this space and you get in people's faces, whether it be a Destiny, Hassan, Vosh, all the political people, you know, it's going to be through consistently streaming on top of what you're already doing. You have the audience. You have not only audience, but you have a consistent, ideologically consistent audience that is going to be here for it as well. So I totally believe you should do it. And you're good at it. You're great at rhetoric. You're great at talking. You can, you know, debate most people under the fucking table who you're going to encounter. So,
well, thank you, Brogan. That's very kind. It's just, I guess like and you know, we've talked about this a bit. Like when I stream, like I'm just so bombarded with questions that it's kind of hard to kind of like have extended kind of extemporaneous conversations of the sort that we've been having, or the kind that you do, like when you're streaming and you kind of have like, you know, monologues, which is why it's fun to listen to, because it's fun to hear you kind of pause it and analyze and think through and all that kind of stuff. And it's just kind of harder to do when you're a bigger channel. Although I remember I actually asked Destiny about this, and I said, like, how do you deal with like your super chats and all the comments and that kind of thing? And he was just kind of like, I just ignore them. Like, I just say what I want to say, and like, people want to give me money, that's fine, but you know, I'm not going to answer their question. I don't have any obligation to do it. And you know, it's maybe a little hard-hearted, but I guess that's what you got to do when you're at a certain scale, because you know, you can't answer every question, you can't respond to everyone in the chat. So at some point, I guess you're just going to have to decide that that's not the kind of streamer you're going to be anymore. So,
yeah, I mean, but anyway, go to Stream Elements, put the banner up that says like $10 to answer questions. You know, be selfish. If someone's going to pay $2 and ask you like what your favorite kind of cheese is, don't let that derail your tangent or your train of thought.
Yeah. No, it's
The first question was, for me personally, and I feel like this opinion is pretty widely represented. The appeal of Trump, regardless of like the nitpicky policy issues, is that given some sort of worst case scenario global conflict, I feel like I trust Trump more to avoid a catastrophe than I would Kamala.
Why is that?
I just think like he seems, for as much as I disagree with isolationism, but it seems like, given some sort of heating up like the Ukraine-Russia conflict, for example, he wouldn't be so quick to involve the U.S. more and more and more and more in that conflict. If Russia is going to heat it up to the point where like American people are going to start losing their lives, or there's going to be like some potential of like a nuclear war or strikes in Europe, he would pull back and be like, you know what, fuck it, I'm out. This is not going to happen. So, and for a lot of people, that is like their biggest worry, is that we are approaching, whether you believe that or not, we're approaching some sort of global conflict, or like some global conflict is heating up currently heating up right now.
Yeah.
So do you agree with that? Do you think that Trump would be better in power to avoid mass casualties in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, like, there's a cost to be paid by any sort of foreign policy agenda. And, like, what sort of Trump is incoherent, but at least what sort of, like, Trump apologists sort of posit his foreign policy agenda to be is kind of a sort of soft isolationism. I mean, like, that's what America First, purports to offer. But the problem is then, like, the cost is then paid in terms of the geopolitical consequences that follow from America abandoning its sort of leadership role in the geopolitical space. So it's like, if America like abandons Ukraine, what then happens is that, Ukraine is conquered by Russia, and then Russia sort of conquers other sort of neighboring countries, and it sort of brings Europe into a sort of state of war, which then I think makes American involvement more likely, not less likely. Like if strongmen like Putin are just kind of like allowed to go on the march and conquer more of Europe, right? That makes a conflict, like I said, like more likely, right? Like the whole idea of why you fight proxy wars is that you don't have to fight a direct war. It's not, it's not the other way around, right? Like we're giving money to the Ukrainians so that we don't have to fight the Russians directly. We fight the Russians through the Ukrainians, and that if Putin is defeated in Ukraine, then that limits his ambition and sort of makes him go back to Moscow and realize that he has no opportunity for territorial expansion, and then maybe that makes him seen as a loser in the context of his own domestic sort of political space, and then maybe that leads to a transition in Russian leadership towards something that's more peace-minded and less bellicose, and that, which is like a win. Like that's a W, right? It's not obvious to me at all that like Putin winning the Ukraine war and sort of getting like empowered by a defeat of American leadership is something that makes sort of a grander, more dangerous conflict less likely. And the same as like with Taiwan, right? Like we want to defend our Taiwanese allies because we don't want the Chinese to feel like that they have an unchecked free hand in Asia when it comes to sort of territorial ambition there. Same with like in Israel and Gaza. We don't want Israel's enemies to sort of feel like that they've got the winds at their back, and that they can sort of like broaden the Middle Eastern conflict in any sort of dangerous way. So no, like I don't kind of agree with that. I think that like isolationism is always a kind of like naive fantasy. The idea is that because we don't sort of think and care and aren't involved in these overseas conflicts, that those overseas conflicts will just kind of peter themselves out and work themselves out, and they'll never sort of bother us, take up any mental space in our minds ever again. And I think actually that's quite naive. And I think that that's actually one of the lessons of World War II even, right? Where there was an isolationist streak that was very strong in America that didn't want America to get involved in World War II, didn't want them to fight Hitler or the Japanese. And then you sort of saw what happened, is that the period of time in which America was not involved in World War II resulted in the expansion of the sort of the destructive force of fascism in Europe and Asia.
I agree with that. Can't argue there. I'm trying to think if I can. I mean, I guess like I don't know. I mean, the fear of like a nuclear conflict is so unimaginable that it almost seems illogical to and it's not. I guess it's not illogical to put it on the table, because it would be. It's like, of course, the ultimate fear of any conflict, especially involving Russia, is that there's going to be an eventual nuclear conflict. But no, I agree with you 100%. Is that, like, regardless of what Russia's doing, you have to. That's the U.S.'s. That's the world's strength. That's why everything's gotten better over the past since World War II. For almost every country that's westernized and become industrialized, is that the U.S. is behind them. If it was another country, I don't think it would have been the case. So, no, I'm with you 100%. Final question.
Okay,
Why should Canadians care so much about American politics? Because I yap about... I know the answer. For my audience, not for me. Because I yap about it so much, as most Canadians do, and I always get the question of, like, why do you care? You're not involved. So just, give a broad answer to my viewer, my chat right now.
My like, I feel like I can defend it better than I think some like left-wing Canadians can, because like there's a lot of like Canadians on the left who like very clearly like hate America and yet are fascinated by American politics, and I think there's a certain incoherence there. But I love America, and I'm very emotionally invested in America's success, because I do think that America's success is Canada's success. And so when you see, as we sort of saw when we were looking at the economic data, like the degree to which the the Canadian and American numbers historically, the lines move in the same direction, because Canada is carried by American success. All of the great sort of technological innovations come out of America and then are adapted into Canada. There's a saying I said in one of my videos, America innovates and Canada emulates, right? So we have a very vested interest in American success, and I think we have an interest in American success when it comes to maintaining a sort of stable, peaceful global international order, like we just kind of said. Canadians benefit from the peace that America's dominant global position brings, and I think that we should not want to see that decline. It's just like, if you have a broadly pro-American perspective, you have an interest in the outcomes of the American political system. And I think that anybody that's pro-America should not want an anti-American government like Donald Trump's to come to power again, one that represents a kind of a self-loathing and would usher in, I think, a period of American stagnation and decline. I think there's no way in which Canada benefits from that. I think there's no way in which basically any country in the world, except for America's enemies, benefits from that. So that's my perspective. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it also has to be conceded that if you're interested in topics like philosophy and abstract ideology and abstract sort of political discourse, which, even though I denounce it, it is obviously interesting to a lot of people, that is playing out in the American context. The more vigorous debates about sort of more sort of substantial, sexy, moral issues are happening in an American political context. So if you're interested in that, you have to kind of concede that America's where it's going on. It's not going on in Canada. It's not even going on in, England or France or wherever else. These interesting things are happening in America. But, I prefer, sometimes when you hear Canadians, particularly Canadians on the left, talk about this, the way that they attempt to justify it is they say it they frame it in negative terms, right? They say that anything bad in America will inevitably come to Canada too. So you have to like keep an eye on America before the bad things sort of make their way north, or some way like America's like the coming attractions preview at the movie. What's next for us? But I like to sort of try to frame it in a more pro-American kind of way, where it's like to sort of say, like, as Canadians, we should be invested in a happy, prosperous, democratic, strong, thriving future for the U.S. And I'm on my, I'm on the edge of my seat about this election precisely because I will be very disappointed as a pro-American person if Donald Trump gets back in, because I will view that as reflecting, a period of decline for America. And, that's bad, I think, on its own terms, but it is also bad as people that share this continent with the United States and have historically been so dependent on American innovation and know-how and economic growth for everything that makes this country a great place to live.
Great, I feel it. I'm with you. 100%.
I've enjoyed your pro-American rhetoric, Brogan. I think it's very important to be.
I feel it. I feel it because when I was in university, where every young man gets radicalized.
Yes.
I never encountered anybody who could point to a material alternative to anything, right? And it's like, of course that's the case. It's like when people critique democracy, I never see them critique democracy and be like, oh, here is where this does it better. It's like no one does it better. Like, of course a fucking first past the post two-party system sucks in contrast to what could be ideologically. But where are we seeing this done better? What is the alternative? Is the alternative a dictatorship? No, of course it's not. Right? Like, you need to let these processes play out. So it's like, I'm going to defend these things tooth and nail no matter what. Of course, there's a better, ideological alternative. In theory, in lore, there's a better alternative. But it's like, as it exists right now, why would I throw out the baby with the bathwater? Because I think that because I think that this process could be slightly improved. Right? When someone comes to me like and is anti-democratic or says that, like, democracy doesn't work or like free markets don't work or like all this, and they point to all these niche problems, and I'm like, of course there's niche problems, of course there's like these small issues, but like on the totality of the situation is that it works well. People are doing fine. We're not killing each other for fucking food, so
Yes.
Let's keep it there. We're the center of commerce and business globally. Let's try to maintain that at the very least. Just like maintain it,
No, absolutely. We have so much to be thankful for, and I feel like as I get older and as I sort of ponder my own sort of role in the world, one thing that I really want to champion more aggressively is sort of like the politics of gratitude, which I think is something that's sort of severely missing. The idea to be appreciative of what we have and to understand that what we have is not just something that just kind of like, as Kamala Harris might say, fell out of a coconut tree, right? Like it is the result of an inheritance of certain liberal traditions and institutions like democracy, capitalism, free markets, sort of compassionate laws and all of this. Like, they're all very important parts of our heritage, and I think we have to be grateful for them, and we have to defend them, and we have to not treat them frivolously because we feel a little bit bored with how good things are on some level.
Sorry, JJ. Gratitude doesn't make money, so it's over. Right. West has fallen.
But I'm grateful, Brogan, that you've given me so much time to yap on your live stream. So I'm very grateful for that. I always enjoy talking to you a great deal, Brogan. You're a very, very smart and with it young man, and I am enjoying following your career as an intellectual, as a commentator, as everything else, as a content provider. So thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Yeah, West has fallen. I'm pivoting right now. It's over. It's so over. It's never been more over. Personally,
is that so?
Yeah.
Well, that'll probably make you. It's like you said. If you just make streams where you say nothing but that, maybe you'll probably almost certainly make a lot more money. But,
I'll get a Rolex on my wrist in like 6 months if I keep saying that. So things are good.
Oh, good God, Jesus.
All right, it's been a pleasure. I'll make sure this is clipped and reposted.
All right, Brogan.
All right,
have a good rest of your night.
Also, I know. Sorry, you can't come to the Godspeed You Black Emperor concerts the night of the election.
I've got it's some weird timing, isn't it?
Yeah, it sucks.
Are you going to go to the concert? Like, how have you sort of worked this out in your mind? Like, what a kind of like poetic moment that's going to be when you're listening to the music on the night that America changes one way or the other?
I'm conflicted. I could stream or I could go see my favorite band. I feel like it's gonna be the latter.
I think there's something kind of like charming and sort of romantic about that, especially as a young guy like you. Like, you're going to see many, many more elections, right? This is an important election, but you'll remember where you were when either, the first woman president was elected or when the horrible Donald Trump sort of ascended to his second non-consecutive term. Right. And it might be a more sort of powerful and meaningful memory if you're doing something that you enjoy while that historic moment is unfolding. So, yeah,
I feel like I'm going to go see that show. It's they dropped a new album yesterday, actually. I listened to the whole thing today. It's what is today, the 6th, the 5th?
Today's the 5th.
Oh, they dropped it, today. So, like, I listened to it today, like, afternoon. Very good. Like, fucking just always such a good band. Favorite band. Yeah, so I'm definitely going to go see that.
All right. Well, now that we've worked that out, I think I'm going to head out and get some pizza. So thanks so much for having me again, Brogan, and good luck with the rest of your night.
My pleasure. I hope we can do it again soon.
For sure, man. All right. Peace out.
See ya.